The train pulled in slow as if the land itself weren't in any kind of hurry. Dust curled up under the iron wheels and drifted across the platform like forgotten lace. A handful of townsfolk stood watching, some out of routine, others for curiosity. Nothing ever arrived that hadn't been warned of in advance. Letters came first, then people, but today there was no letter for the woman who stepped down. She came down carefully, gripping the railing in a way that told you she didn't trust wooden things. Her body moved like it remembered being mocked, cautious, compacted, shaped not just by weight but by years of eyes that narrowed before speaking. Her Clayton dress was old but clean, its buttons straining slightly, the fabric clinging to her waist and hips like it was ashamed of the task. Her boots were worn but polished, the hat was too small, as if it belonged to someone she'd once loved but who no longer loved her. Back she carried one bag, canvas scuffed at the bottom, tied with frayed rope. She stood there on the edge of the platform, with the heat already gathering under her arms and the whispers behind her not bothering to whisper who she, for no one sent for that. She looks like she ate the bread on the way. Laughter sharp and dry carried easily on the hot breeze. She turned slightly as if to walk back onto the train, but the door had closed behind her. At the far end of the platform a man leaned against the post of the feed station. He was tall, worn through at the edges, the kind of man who looked like he once smiled but forgot how. His name was Clayton Turner, and everyone in town knew him as the widower of the prettiest woman the county had ever buried. He hadn't remarried, hadn't spoken much, hadn't brought a woman anywhere near the ranch in nearly 7 years until now. He stepped off the platform, boots thudding softly on the cracked planks. The crowd parted without asking, the way they always did when Clayton walked anywhere with purpose. His shirt was faded, blue sleeves rolled, his hands were callous but they didn't hang heavy like some men's, they were gentle even in rest. He walked up to the woman who hadn't yet turned to face him. "Ma'am," he said. She turned slowly, her cheeks flushed from heat and something deeper. Her eyes met his and something in them flinched. She was used to stare but not this kind. He didn't smile, didn't leer, just studied her like she wasn't a riddle or a problem or a punishment but something else, something placed. Said, "You're coming with me." He said. The silence that followed cracked open like a thunder. Theta from the boarding house nearly choked on her spit. A boy standing near the water barrel dropped his apple. The woman blinked. "I beg your pardon, you heard me, come on." She gripped her bag tight, her eyes darting. "I wasn't sent for, I was just told to leave. I have no place, no name." "You'd know." Clayton nodded. "That's fine, I've got enough name for both of us." She looked over his shoulder. The sheriff had wandered out of the post office, hat in hand. "Clayton," he called, "you know this lady?" Clayton didn't look away from her. "I do." Now the sheriff stepped forward quietly. "You talking her out to the ranch?" "Yep." "She your kin?" "No." "She your wife?" Clayton paused, then looked at her again, his voice steady as a nail-head. "She's mine." It wasn't a confession, it was a decision. The sheriff Esquintet nodded, slow, and tipped his head. "All right then." Annie, though no one had asked her name, stood still for a long moment, then she looked past Clayton toward the road beyond town. It shimmered in the heat, a wavering ribbon that led into a horizon wide enough for reinvention. She followed him. The wagon was simple, 2 benches, one missing its cushion. He helped her up without speaking and she sat with her hands in her lap like they didn't belong to her. They rode through town under open as an pinched mouths. Women turned their backs quickly as if to shield their husbands from the sight. Children gawked. The church bell chimed behind them, mocking like a laugh. With God's permission she didn't ask where they were going. He didn't ask who she'd been. After a long silence he offered a canteen. She hesitated before drinking. The water was warm but clean. When she handed it back he finally spoke again. "Name's Clayton." She nodded. "Annie?" He nodded in return. "Annie," he repeated, like tasting it. They crossed a ridge and the land began to open. Golden wheat fields, tall pine groves, a house just barely visible between the hills. She exhaled like she'd been holding her breath since stepping off the train. When they arrived the house was modest but sturdy. A white curtain danced out of an upstairs window, pale like a ghost waving. He let her enter first. Inside the air was cooler, lived in but untouched. One chair at the table, one plate, one fork, a book turned upside down beside a teacup long since emptied. She walked into the kitchen and saw a shawl hanging by either door, 4 pale green chewed. Clayton cared for her but too beloved to be thrown away. Clayton stood behind her. "Not too close," was hers. He said. "Ain't moved it yet." "Anya nodded. "I won't touch it." He paused. "You can if you like." "I won't," she said again and meant it. He turned and moved to stoke the stove as if the conversation had concluded. She stood in the silence a moment longer, then began to take in the room, the walls, the way the floor creaked under her heavier steps, the mirror she avoided looking into. Finally she said, "You don't even know what I've done." Clayton paused, hand on the stove handle. "Don't matter. What if I was?" Her voice caught. "What if I was the reason they sent me away?" Clayton looked over at her, then down at the flame. "They don't send away men like me," he said quietly, "even when we break things." She swallowed hard. Later he showed her the spare room. It was dusty but decent. The bed groaned under her weight but not unkindly. She unpacked nothing. She didn't have anything to unpack. She sat on the bed staring out the window until the sun dropped. That night she cried softly. Years of tears had taught her how to keep them quiet, but the floorboards creaked outside her door and a glass of water was left there without a word. By morning she stepped into the kitchen to find a bowl of porridge still warm. Clayton didn't look at her when she sat, but he put out 2 spoons. The town would talk. Theta surely already was, but in the quiet of that room Annie took the first full breath she'd taken in a long time. And just as the wind began to peak up outside carrying the scent of something not quite summer anymore, she looked at him and whispered, "Why?" Clayton didn't look up from his bowl. He stirred once, then said plainly, because I saw you standing like no one was ever going to see you again. And across the room the shawl by the door fluttered once, like it too had been holding its breath the morning after Annie arrived. The sun pulled itself slow across the dry hills, pouring warm gold into the quiet house. She woke before the rooster and sat at the edge of the bed, ankles swollen from travel, hands folded like she was waiting for someone to knock and say there'd been a mistake, but the only sound was the steady tick of a wall clock and the soft whimper of wind against the shutters. She washed her face in the basin. The mirror above it didn't flatter, but it didn't lie either. She ran her hands down the front of her dress, smoothing fabric that wouldn't smooth, and walked barefoot across cool wooden planks until she reached the kitchen. Clayton was already at the stove frying thick slices of bread and lard. The smell reminded her of when her mother used to cook before her mother started saying things that felt like bruises. He didn't turn when she entered. He just spoke in that even, rock-clear tone of his. There's coffee on the table, stronger than it ought to be. She poured a cup, not quite meeting his eye. I don't mind bitter. He nodded once, handed her a plate. Eat what you can. The bread was crisp at the edges, soft in the center. She didn't say it aloud, but it was the first warm meal she'd had in days, maybe longer, maybe since before being asked to leave. Like a parcel gone sour, they ate in quiet, the kind that wasn't cold but wasn't quite warm yet either. Afterward he offered her a solemn gesture toward the porch. It's early, but the air is good for thinking. She followed him outside, wrapped in wool that smelled faintly of cedar. The land rolled out in soft browns and dusty golds, the kind of open that made a person feel both free and very, very small. He pointed to the eastern ridge. That's where I buried her, my wife. Annie's fingers twitched on the shawl. You talk of her like someone who still lives here. She does, he said in little ways. Was she? Annie hesitated, then dared the question. Beautiful. Clayton looked out over the fields. She was. Wind came and went, couldn't hold still, not even long enough to finish her tea. And he didn't ask how she died. She figured death came in many forms, fevers, false infant, Clayton ties. All she knew was that Clayton's voice didn't tremble when he spoke of her, but there was a hollowness behind the words, like a house with all the furniture taken out. Wouldn't have liked you, he added after a pause, not because of you, just wouldn't have liked your silence. She liked laughter too much to understand quiet. Annie looked down. Most don't understand it. I do, he said that afternoon. Annie offered to clean. Clayton nodded, handed her a pail and said, only don't touch the back room. She didn't ask why. She worked slowly, carefully. Clayton on thick knees and scrubbing floorboards that creaked in protest. She washed the windows, ironed the linens, peeled potatoes with practiced hands. With every task completed, the house seemed to breathe a little easier, like it had forgotten what it was to be needed. Clayton worked outside repairing a stretch of fencing half swallowed by dry grass. She watched him through the window once, the way his muscles moved with purpose, how he wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his hand without thinking. A man who didn't ask for much but gave more than he knew. Around sunset she brought him a tin cup of well water. He took it, drank and handed it back. Their fingers brushed. She didn't pull away, but she didn't linger either. You work like you're trying to earn your keep, he said. Annie looked at the horizon. It's not that I want to earn it, it's that I don't want to be sent away again. He didn't answer, just nodded once and got back to hammering. The next day they went into town. He needed nails and flowers. She wasn't sure, maybe proof that someone saw her standing beside him. They rode in the wagon side by side. Her hands were tucked in her lap, trying not to tremble. His hand was on the residential, but his fingers occasionally tapped a rhythm on his thigh, like he was thinking of music he'd once heard. When they pulled into town, silence spread like ink. Theta stood on the porch of the boarding house, her arms crossed tight. A few women near the general store stopped mid-conversation. A child pointed. Annie stared straight ahead, her chin lifted a little higher than she felt. Inside the store, Clayton busied himself with supplies. While Annie wandered the shelves, she paused at a bolt of plum-colored cloth, heavy cotton with a small floral weave. She ran her fingers along it, imagining a dress that fit without apology. Theta appeared beside her, voice like vinegar. That's an expensive fabric for someone just passing through. Annie didn't look at her. I wasn't planning on passing through. Oh, there's planning and then there's fitting. You might want something sturdier. Annie turned away. The fabric stayed folded untouched, but that night, when she returned to the ranch, the bolt of cloth was sitting on the porch, wrapped in brown paper, paid in full. She opened it slowly, hands trembling hard. Loud when she turned, Clayton was in the doorway, wiping his hands on a rag. You left it, she said. You looked at it, he replied. She didn't cry, not then, but she did stay up late cutting and pinning. Her stitches weren't perfect, but they were hers. Over the next few days they settled into a rhythm. She rose before him, started the fire. He brought in water without being asked. They spoke only when needed, but their silences shifted from heavy to companionable, from watchful to known. She noticed he hummed while feeding the horses, a low wordless tune. She found herself humming it while making cornbread one evening. As a thunderstorm gathered in the distance, Annie stepped outside and watched the sky bruise into deep purples. Clayton joined her, leaning against the porch rail. I used to hate storms, she said. Too loud, too sudden. Clayton nodded. They don't ask permission, neither did my folks when they threw me out. He didn't ask why, they did, just said storms pass, even the bad ones. They stood that way for a long time. That night she dreamed of a table set for two, not just out of kindness but out of expectation. The next morning she baked a pie from scratch, used the last of the preserves. Clayton came in from the field, dust in his hair, and stared at it like it was a portrait. She sliced him a piece. He took a bite, then looked up at her with something unspoken, something kind and ferocious. At once. You make home feel like it used to, he said, but better. She didn't know what to do with that, so she said, the crust too thick. He smiled. That's the best part, but not everything sweet can stay untouched. The following Sunday a letter arrived, not for Annie, for Clayton, a scrolled message from Reverend Packer. Soft but firm folks were starting to ask about the arrangement, about the woman, about St. Annie. Read the letter before Clayton returned from the stable. She folded it twice, hands still shaking, and left it on the table. When he entered she was already tying her bag shut. I don't want to be a stain on your reputation, she said without looking at him. Clayton's brows furrowed. What are you talking about? You took me and gave me shelter. That's kindness, but I won't have them thinking less of you. He reached across the table, laid his hand on hers. You think I care what they think? You should, she whispered. I did, he said once. She blinked up at him. But not anymore, he added. Not since I found what I didn't even know I was looking for. The fire crackled behind them. Outside the wind had picked up, leaves fluttered across the dirt path like scattered pages. Annie swallowed hard. You don't even know who I am. You know what you are, he said. You're the reason this house don't echo no more. Her voice cracked. And what if they make you choose? He didn't answer at first, just moved to the window, looked out toward the distant hills. Then I reckon I'll choose the thing that makes the silence stop hurting. The room fell quiet again, but this time it wasn't hollow, it was full. And in the far corner of the room the shawl, his wife's shawl, had fallen from the hook, laid on the floor like it had finally let go. The mornings had begun to soften. The sting of summer's heat gave way to crisp dryer that clung to the porch railings and made the floorboards creak with cold. Before dawn Annie rose before Clayton now every morning, sometimes without knowing why. She didn't yet think of the ranch as hers, but her hands moved through it like they belonged, brushing flour from the counter, airing quilts, humming in the silence. Without realizing she'd begun to speak more, not often, but when she did her voice came out, round and low. The way a cello might sound if it ever confessed anything. One gray afternoon, with clouds stretched wide and slow above the wheat, she wandered into the hallway closet. The house had grown so quiet that she didn't feel like she was intruding anymore, only remembering a trunk sat beneath an old hunting coat. She opened it carefully as if expecting it to argue. It didn't. Inside, folded with a reverence only grief teaches, were the belongings of another woman, Clayton's wife, a pale blue dress with the Clayton Kate lace at the collar and ribbons the color of twilight tucked into the seams. Annie lifted it out gently. The fabric felt like whispering, like something meant for softness and applause. She brought it into her room and laid it out across the bed. She'd never worn anything so light. Her dresses were always heavier, built to hide and survive, not to float. She undressed slowly, looked into the mirror only once before slipping the blue dress over her shoulders. The bodice caught at her ribs. She pulled the fabric down, held her breath, twisted to reach the buttons. They stopped halfway. Her arms began to shake. She tried again and again until the thread strained and snapped with a tiny sound that felt like thunder in her chest. She stood there halfway dressed and wholly humiliated. Fabric bunched like rejection across her back. Her breath hitched. Her knees gave. Slow and silent she sank onto the floor beside the bed. The dress twisted around her like accusation. She didn't cry loud. She didn't need to. Her body remembered too well how to hold pain quietly. A knock at the door startled her. Clayton's voice followed. You all right in there? She wiped her face quickly. Yes, thought I heard something fall. She paused. Just me? He hesitated. Need help? No. She gathered the dress, folded it carefully again. It had not been made for her, not in cloth or in memory. That evening she didn't come to supper. Clayton left a plate at her door. She didn't touch it. The next morning she rose before the rooster again, but this time here hands had purpose. She took the bolt of plum fabric from the shelf. She cleared the table and laid it out flat. She pinned it to a pattern she'd carried only in her head, one built for her hips, her arms, the rise of her belly. She cut without flinching, sewed with small steady stitches even as her fingers bled from the dullness of the needle. By noon Clayton appeared in the doorway, wiping sawdust from his palms. Smells like ambition in here, he said. She didn't look up. Trying something that fits you? Watched her for a while. You always so like you're proving a point. She tied off a thread. Only when I've been told I shouldn't. That night she finished the dress. It wasn't perfect. The seams wandered a bit, the neckline drooped, but it was hers, built for her body, her breath, her battle. She wore it to the well the next morning, a little looser in the sleeves, a little firmer in the waist. When Clayton saw her he paused mid-step. That color suits you, he said. It's plum, looks like the hills before rain. She smiled once, just once, then looked down quickly. It doesn't fit like other dresses. Maybe that's why it's right. The next time they went into town she wore the dress. People stared, but differently now, some still with contempt, others with curiosity. Theta squinted at her from behind, her parasol lips pursed like lemons. Annie walked straighter at the general store. Annie again wandered toward the fabric shelves. She picked up a pale yellow bolt, something light and cheerful. She examined it, not because she needed it but because she could. Theta said, let up, voice tight and dripping. Getting real confident, aren't we? Annie turned to her. Come, I like the feel of it. Theta smiled without warmth. Some fabrics don't flatter everyone. That one's for spring girls, not winter women. Annie let her words hang, then placed the fabric back gently. You'd be surprised what blooms in winter. Theta scoffed and turned away, but Annie didn't walk off with hunched shoulders. This time she returned to Clayton, who had just paid for their flour. You all right? he asked, glancing toward Theta. Annie touched the corner of her new dress. I didn't shrink, she said quietly, and I didn't snap. That's new. They rode home with the windows of the town closing behind them, but Annie didn't feel shut out. Later that week she found an old butter churn behind the barn, broken, left to rot. She hauled it inside, fixed the hinge, scrubbed the wood and left Cream to settle By dusk she had butter cooling and biscuits rising. Clayton entered, the smell catching him in the doorway. He watched her wipe her hands on her apron, saw the way her shoulders moved when she worked, how her hair curled in the steam. There was something de